Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the session on organizational behavior. We're going to be looking at, covering learning outcome 4 today. In our session today, we are going to be focused on, looking at power, politics, and culture and how they influence employee behavior and help accomplish, organizational goals within the organization. We have so far, if I do a quick recap in terms of what we've covered so far, we've looked at, various things in terms of what is organization, what is behavior, why do we look at organization, study of organization behavior in general, because as I mentioned some time back, it's a combination of 3 or 4 different sciences that we need to bring it in order to understand how individuals behave under a particular environment. And what factors can affect the attitude, behavior, and and how the culture and the structure of the organization can essentially influence, motivate, or demotivate employees to work towards the organizational goals. So it looks at we look at primarily understanding human resources. We look at psychology. We also look at a bit of management. And then we also dipped into understanding leadership, some of the leadership theories and main theories of motivation, which were very important in understanding how managers and leaders motivate, employees, staff, people working within the organization to work towards the organizational goals. So the first learning outcome was more focused on understanding personality, perceptions, culture, vision, mission of the organization. Second one was focused on understanding motivational theories and how motivational theories can be used successfully by managers to motivate staff, things through which they can review performance, reward systems, incentives, bonuses. And then clearly be looking at a lot of theories in motivation, grouping them into 3 different categories. Maslow's theory of hierarchy, we looked at theory X and Y, some of the models which basically help us understand power, politics, influence within the organization. Then we also looked at working within teams, why teams are working within teams is important, why teams are formed, how teams are formed. And we studied 2 of the important team building models. One was Stuckman's model of team building, the 5 stages. And then we also looked at Dr. Belbin's team roles, the 9 roles, the 3 categories that he has come up with in terms of his workings, and now they are widely accepted. And this helps managers also then provide and then give roles to different people when they work in teams within the organization as a part of, say, an project essentially. And in those cases, they are looking at essentially completing, and meeting the goals and objectives set by the management. Now, with that particular bit going forward, what we want to be able to now do is in learning outcome 4 is understand and examine the role of power, politics, and culture, and how it can influence employees' behavior, and how this then can be used in terms of, some of the dimensions that we will look at, and how this can be used by managers essentially to understand the personality, character of the individuals, and then looking at how they base it, on the values, beliefs, and goals, and then put people through various steps in terms of, making sure that they are motivated enough, there are resources available to the employees, and obviously rewards and incentives available, which will allow them to, move them towards the direction of achieving organizational goals. So here we will be looking at examining 3 important components: the role of essentially power within an organizational culture. Then we will also be looking at the role of politics, or sometimes we use and come across the term organizational politics. There's a lot of politics in the organization. That is what we will look at. And then the third is how the people yielding power and people who are involved in actively politics within the organization at the senior level, how can they influence the culture of the organization? So these are 3 characteristics or 3 important, parts that we are going to be looking at in today's learning outcome. Now, there is a fair bit of content to be covered. When we look at the indicative content, we are looking at essentially covering, some of the topics related to power, some topics related to politics, and then some topics related to culture. Now, there are two particular theoretical models or frameworks that we're going to be focused on understanding. One is the Hofstede cultural dimensions model, the 6 dimensions which he proposed. And we look at his work and how this has become central to organizations, because large businesses which have global operations or operations in very many different countries, they need to look at understanding these 6 dimensions and obviously use them to be able to then motivate employees, staff, and make them work towards the achievement of organizational goals. We'll also look at how Edgar Schein, he has written a number of books. And obviously, when we look at Edgar Schein, we will also be looking at his work in terms of understanding the different, models or different dimensions, 3 dimensions he has actually proposed. And this basically, looks at his particular aspect of, obviously he's a notable scholar. And when we look at the study of, the organizational culture, he has made significant contributions to the understanding of what is culture and what impact does culture have on the organization. He developed several frameworks and obviously models which would help us in a better understanding organization and how, as managers or leaders, we can manage the culture within the organization. And one of the models, which is where his signature work has been done and he's been recognized, is that he identified 3 levels of culture, which is named as artifacts, espoused values and basic assumptions. And this is what we will go into a bit more detail when we look at, studying the role of culture and how culture manifests at different levels within the organization. Now, his work has significant impact on the field of organization behavior because of the fact that he helped us identify how a strong culture within the organization can be rooted to, meeting objectives which are set by the management, the role of communication when we talk about culture, the role of learning, or when we talk about learning within the organization, and how the staff and employees or contractors essentially adapt to building an environment which allows workers, employees, staff, contractors to be able to work seamlessly towards achieving these goals. And that is all going to be relevant when we look at look at maybe understanding culture. And from his point of view, the model he proposed, the 3 dimensions of culture that he proposed, and that is what we will look at understanding. Now, there are a couple of things in today's learning outcome. We will go through some of the areas of the indicative content which will reflect on, the role of culture, how culture helps in, creating a culture of success within the organization. Politics and power can be used by leaders and managers to look at creating success within the organization. We will look at the role of values and beliefs in particular, when we can talk about the development of culture or a type of culture which originates or exudes from a particular organization. And then we look at what are the basic types of power and what does power who has in terms of influence over the culture of the organization, the structure of the organization. So towards the end, we'll also be looking at 2 theories. One is network theory and the systems theory. And these are 2 frameworks which basically help us understand, when we talk about the culture of the organization, and when we talk about essentially, how does the organization, function. When we look at these 2 frameworks, they will be helping us understand, what are the various types of relationships which can be formed when we talk about culture of the organization. And then when we talk about, viewing the organization as holistic systems, that means organizations themselves acting as independent entities, which are made up of interdependent departments: marketing, sales, engineering, production, administration, finance, that kind of thing. And then no department can actually work in isolations. So we will look at the systems view and we look at the network view, which is primarily network proposing when organization is a collection of various departments which have strong interpersonal relationships, which help in obviously meeting its objective. And the systems theory saying it's a holistic system, and obviously as an organization we will look at that. Yes, there are departments, but they can also work in terms of having a bit more importance. So, for example, in certain organizations, you generally see marketing or sales takes more precedence. In some organizations, it's engineering or production because it's a manufacturing organization, and the production of the product or the uniqueness of the product is the key. In some cases, if you look at financial services, obviously financial services side of things would be the key. So systems theory would mandate and emphasize on the importance of how changes can be done in one part of the system and can impact the other side. And that is where we look at understanding these two theories and relate them to power, politics, and culture, and how they influence the employee behavior and helps the organization accomplish its goal. So that's the background in terms of the learning outcome that we are going to be looking at covering today. With this, what I'm going to do is switch you over to the presentation slides. So we are looking at, covering today's discussion with, a couple of slides which I've drawn up. If it becomes a bit too long, then what I will do is basically break this session into two parts, part one and part two. But generally looking at the role of, power, politics, and culture that we are going to understand in terms of how they influence employee behavior, and then how employees look at achieving and behaving under that under the influence of power, politics, and the culture, and then see how they accomplish various objectives within the organization. So we look at this in three parts. Let's look at starting with some key terminology, and then the way I would look at is, let me literally get into understanding what is politics, what is power when we talk in the context of organization, and what is the influence of culture, or what is the context of culture when we talk in terms of organization. So the first question that I have in mind, which I want to put forward and get some thoughts, are that what is the influence of power within the organization? So what do we define as power? So when we talk about power, of the organization, or power, influence of power, what we are looking at basically doing in this case is talking about, so if I put it this way, that there are people who would have positions and titles within the organization, and because of those positions and titles, they will enjoy certain, amount of power. That means decision-making power that allows them to, make decisions, whether it could be financial, managerial, or, decisions which can be done from a point of view of which can affect other people or other employees within the organization, would be termed as power. So power would be essentially related to either decision-making in terms of resource allocation. I could also say that they will have power when they communicate. Essentially, they would have the ability to be able to influence maybe employee behavior. And in some cases, if they are at the absolute high end in the organization, which is top management or senior management, then they would also have the ability to be able to, determine organizational outcomes or influence organizational outcomes. So when we look at the influence of power within the organization, we are looking at that power as a whole in terms of the subject can be wielded if you are if you occupy an important position, or your position within the organization allows you to then, get decision-making ability, or abilities which will allow you to be able to make independent decisions. And these can be of different types, as I mentioned. So you could have the power to make decisions which could be related to, saying that, okay, we will say absolute decision could be, if you're the CEO of the organization, chief executive, you might say, okay, we would want to expand in this location, or we would not want to sell our product at this price or at that price because it is not profitable for the business. So in some cases, you might make a decision that, okay, in order to penetrate the market, we might need to sell at loss, or even if the company doesn't make profits, we'll cross-subsidize our profits from other geographies, but we would need to create a presence. And that is a significant decision that you can take because you have the ability to make decisions, or you have the power to make decisions with regards to the organization's actions. Resource allocation could be another one, which is to say that, sometimes you allocate resources, marketing budgets, for example, And that could be because you are the head of the department, you are the vice president marketing or something like that. And that allows you to, decide for which particular place or which particular product or which particular category within the company you would want to spend more budgets or allocate more budgets. And that could be resource. Similarly, these, we could have various ways in which we could define and see the influence of power within the organization. And this can impact the organizational outcomes. That is the important part. So if your decision is correct, and if the decision is carried out as what has been mentioned or detailed out in terms of the plan, then the organizational outcomes or the outcomes which the organization is able to achieve is significant, and it is something which is meeting the objectives as set by the management. So it is important to manage power effectively, and also to ensure that it is being used in a responsible and ethical manner to achieve positive outcomes for the organization and obviously its stakeholders. So here, stakeholders could be, your shareholders, it could be directors, employees, contractors, suppliers, it could be stakeholders like the government, it could be stakeholders like your banks and things like that. Now, when we talk about example of power and influence within the organization, a simple example that I would give you is when you look at, you work within a company and assuming you work within the engineering or, production department, your supervisor or your manager, shift manager can actually be a bit more coercive and, obviously use his position to motivate the shift or the team which is working, the evening shift, and then convince them to achieve the production goals. Now here he's using his power and his influence to influence as a manager to be able to motivate his staff to say that, okay, we have to roll out and make sure that, we deliver 200 vehicles within the shift. And that, could be an example wherein he has the power to make that decision, increase the number of workers in the shift just to meet the goals, or in some cases, motivate the staff by giving out some rewards and incentives. And that could be an example of power in a use of power or influence because of its position in an organization. Now, let's look at the second aspect briefly, is what is the influence of politics and role of politics within organization. So when we talk about, what is the influence of politics, sometimes we do come across, terms like, there's a lot of politics within the organization. So when we, talk about this and we mention what we essentially mean by that is that in the organization, what we are going to see is that there would be people who would, get into discussions, negotiations, persuasions, and, formal, informal discussions or negotiations. And then they would basically be looking at, achieving some objectives, and they would be willing to gain some, in this particular context, what they are going to do is give and take. They would want to achieve their objective, and their objectives could be achieved through the fact that in some cases, if they want to, say, achieve more, say, let's put it this way, there are two different marketing departments or two marketing teams working in two different geographies, and they are looking at, say, for example, getting hold of more budgets for advertising and promotion. Now, as a marketing department, as a department head, who has the ability to be able to sanction budgets for promotion on, say, TV advertising or radio advertising, you would be looking at which particular geography or team is actually able to get me more sales and more market share, or in terms of help sell or more to the customers, or maybe increase the output of the company in the market. Now, you would be then looking at discussing and obviously talking through to various people within the organization, and see which one is where you're going to support. Now, this particular process can happen officially, because in some cases, when the management decides, they would say, okay, this is a new market and this is an old market. In order to support and grow the new market, we will invest more in this market. And for the existing market, when the product is set, the company has a good position in the market, they would not want to invest, or this year they might do lesser investment as compared to, and divert those funds to a newer market in which they have more competition, or they are new essentially, and they want to create a significant dent or presence. Now, in those cases, if the marketing team does not like this happening, then there could be some discussions, negotiations informally, which could happen within the teams. And they would be looking at either doing, and these discussions would be persuasions essentially, and basis the relationship which the people are able to have, they're able to pull favors. And in those cases, you would see, because of the gains they get or the losses they take, they would, when I say they, I mean one of the marketing teams would essentially be successful in utilizing or getting more budgets for promotion and advertising allocated. Now, in this case, we would see and kind of label this as what is called organizational politics. If I don't like somebody and I want to muster up, drum up support, then what will happen is I'll speak to a lot of people informally, which I can influence. I can be, on their books or on their good books. And then I would use my influence, the power that I have, and the position that I occupy in the organization to do so. And that would be organizational politics, because I am looking at undertaking activities which is going to engage in personal gains, or essentially would engage in ensuring that I'm able to achieve that outcome which as an individual I want, as against what the organization wants. And that will be the role of politics within the organization. Now, if I have to say politics, in summary, I would say politics could be something wherein you are able to use some part of your influence, maybe significant influence, by using your relationship, your title, your position within the company, and then influence any decision, any outcomes which could be influenced by decision making that you can do, or the allocation of resources that you can make. And then this would then allow you to achieve your desired outcome. And in those cases, I would say it is organizational politics. Now, what is the influence of culture within the organization? This is also something that we want to understand and put this in context of power and politics. Now, when we talk about culture, and in general, when we talk about the culture of the organization, what we are talking about is basically the personality and the character. Now, organizational culture can be made up of shared values, beliefs. It could have assumptions about how people should behave or interact, and how decisions could be made, and in terms of work activities, and how they should be carried out. Now, key factors that we would look at when we talk about organizational culture is to talk about how we see the behavior of individuals working within the organization happening historically, and also some of the factors that can externally or internally affect the behavior of the people, and that would dictate the nature of the outcome that you would have. And that would be all basically what we look at under culture within the organization. Now, the culture of the organization could also be essential, because it also gives and depicts what kind of leadership the organization have, or what kind of managers or senior management people work within the organization, and then how they motivate their staff, employees, to be able to achieve those goals which are being set by the management. At the end of the year, they have to be achieved. So when we talk about a particular let's say objective which has to be fulfilled, or certain strategies which are put in order to fulfill that objective, then in those cases we are going to be looking at is that it will be based on how people go about doing their jobs on a day-to-day basis, go about achieving these objectives. They would be routinely defined, or showing what kind of culture is actually prevalent within the organization. Now, in order to gain an understanding about the organizational culture, what we also look at is that there are written and unwritten rules sometimes that can be examined alongside relationships, values, behaviors which are displayed by people. But there could be a checklist as well, which basically outlines what could be the approaches proposed by the management and some of the theorists in terms of how to classify organizational cultures. And these then could be seen working within a particular organization. And the idea thereabouts would be to say that if I look at organizational culture, I will look at both the written, unwritten rules, which influence the behavior of an individual and the attitude of the individual to what they bring into the place of work, and then how this can influence the outcome of or outcome. When I say outcome, I mean output of the work which the employee then does for the organization. And this is something which is important when we talk about culture. So culture essentially would be, when we talk about culture of an organization, it is basically going to be referring to the personality and character. And once we know what values, beliefs, and assumptions people have, and this would help managers, leaders to predict how they will behave and what kind of impact will they have in terms of output on the organization. Is that clear? So here, it is important for us to understand the nature of, let's say the three important words in today's learning outcome, which is power, politics, and culture, and how are they related to organization. That is what we want to do before we start, getting into detailing, of this particular learning outcome. Now, what I also want to do is relate and basically show you a particular model, which is what essentially was, it is a work which has been carried out by, Hofstede, which is, Gert Hofstede. He proposed a theory in the 1980s to explain what are the various dimensions and what are the various variations that you can see to the dimensions of culture within an organization. Now, his theory basically comes out with 6 dimensions of culture, and each represents a preference to a certain issue over the other. So here, in order to rather evaluate preferences of the individual, the theory evaluates the preferences on basis, a country. And this would help us distinguish when we look at one particular geography in respect to some other geography. That means if we look at Coca-Cola, which sells, in the United Kingdom, and it also sells its products in France or Germany, then it will help me distinguish one country to the other, because what I would understand is how they would go about essentially selling the products in a location, depending on what are the preferences, needs, and requirements of the customer, and then how it would tailor to meet those needs of same in terms of customers' preference and requirements in a different location, simply because we are looking at 2 different countries, 2 different languages, 2 different currencies, and obviously 2 different sizes of market. And that is where his work became very important and relevant. So let's listen into a particular video which I have got, and that would explain Hofstede cultural dimension. So let me switch you over, and let's look at listening into this particular video. And this would give us a very good understanding of what is culture and why are we looking at culture in this particular sense in very detail for learning outcome 4. Now, as you can see, let me play this particular video now, which should.
Dogs are interesting animals. If you have ever watched a group of different breeds of dogs together, you see there are dogs who are aggressive, those that are mellow. Some want to be the alpha male, and some are content just playing and having a good time. These different dimensions are very similar to Gert Hofstede's cultural dimension theory, a theory that looks at unique aspects of cultures and rates them on a scale for comparison. Gert Hofstede was a professor who researched how people from different countries and cultures interact based on different categories of cultural dimensions. Those categories are power distance. This dimension expresses the degree to which the less powerful members of a society accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. Individualism versus collectivism. This dimension focuses on the question about whether people prefer a close-knit network of people or prefer to be left alone to fend for themselves. Masculinity versus femininity. Masculinity represents a preference in society for achievement, heroism, assertiveness, and material reward for success. Its opposite, femininity, stands for a preference for cooperation, modesty, caring for the weak, and quality of life. Uncertainty avoidance. This dimension expresses a degree to which the member of a society feels uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. And finally, long-term versus short-term orientation. Long-term orientation dimensions can be interpreted as dealing with society's search for virtue. Societies with a short-term orientation generally have a strong concern with establishing the absolute truth. As we look at the different aspects and definitions of these dimensions, we can begin to see how a manager would have to deal with them and interpret them in an international setting. Just looking at individualism versus collectivism shows us that there are societies or people that accept working alone and look at their existence in terms of being an individual rather than part of a group. However, a collectivist would look towards the group's success more so than their own personal satisfaction or accomplishments. Would it surprise you that the US is high on the individual scale, while Japan is more on the collectivist side? This means we Americans think more I than we, while Japan is exactly the other way around. Staying with this example, the US has a low score for uncertainty avoidance. Basically, we are okay with ambiguity and not knowing everything for certain. On the other hand, Japan is very high on this scale, and they do not want uncertainty, they want facts. By now, you are likely thinking that one country compared to another, one will be high and one will be low. This is not the case, though. Take, for example, power distance. Japan and the US are almost equal when it comes to their acceptance of the distribution of power. Knowing what you do now about these two countries, where do you think they land on long-term versus short-term orientation? This, like the other dimensions, directly relates to their culture and societal norms. To that point, the US is lower in the masculinity versus femininity scale, while Japan is much higher. Thus, Japan looks for a more harmonious world where everyone works together, but Americans are fine being the hero. It is easy to see that different cultures have different views of the world based on their culture and history. Understanding these areas and being able to identify them will help you to work with and understand people of varying backgrounds and cultures. If you know the areas we have discussed so far, you are at least having a starting point to understand the person. Hofstede was trying to point out that we are all really not the same. Different cultures have different views of life and business. They are not right or wrong, just different. These dimensions have shaped cultures, and these cultures are shaped by these dimensions. It's a revolving cycle. To illustrate that point, the US is an aggressive culture. We strive for success, are driven to succeed, and thrive on competition. That is our culture, and that culture helps shape and promote those aspects of our society. They are forever linked in a revolving door. To be effective in a global sense, one has to understand the dimensions Hofstede identified and weighed on his scale. Once again, they are power distance. This dimension expresses the degree to which the less powerful members of a society accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. Individualism versus collectivism. Do people prefer a close-knit network of people, or do they prefer to be left alone to fend for themselves? Masculinity versus femininity. This dimension represents a preference in society for achievement, heroism, assertiveness, and material reward for success. Its opposite, femininity, stands for a preference for cooperation, modesty, caring for the weak, and quality of life. Uncertainty avoidance. This dimension expresses the degree to which the member of a society feels uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. Long-term versus short-term orientation. Long-term orientation dimensions can be interpreted as dealing with society's search for virtue. Societies with a short-term orientation generally have a strong concern with establishing the absolute truth. Knowing these, or at least understanding they exist, will help a manager adapt to the culture he or she is working with or living in. It is a way for you to now not take other people's actions or viewpoints personally, and to realize that it is cultural norms that you're dealing with.
So as you can see, this particular short video highlights, the cultural dimensions that we get to see, which are, the 6 dimensions which we get to see, which are generally prevalent within the organization. Now we'll go into a bit more detail with regards to this, simply because this is going to be pivotal for us to cover this particular learning outcome. Now, I have created a few slides, and obviously when we look at Gert Herbsteed, he basically did some initial studies between the time frame 67 to 73, and he evaluated 117,000 employees hailing from different 50 different countries. Now, his initial study resulted in 4 dimensions that he identified, which were cultural dimensions, power and distance, and individualistic dimensions versus collectivist dimensions, and then looking at masculinity versus femininity. But later on, with the work that he did, he also added the 5th dimension, which is short-term versus long-term, and finally the last, or the 6th dimension, which is indulgence versus restraint. Now, these dimensions can be applied globally, and they are quite evident in the aspect that when we look at organization and the people which work within the organization, when we look at some of the key characteristics of organizations in terms of individuals working there, like employment, we look at their education, their behavior, their skills, and obviously what they bring in terms of their experience to the role that they are working in. You would generally see that these characteristics would help shape the culture of the organization. And these dimensions that he identified are then used today in all modern organizations to be able to, get things done, or essentially, ensuring that the organization is moving towards achieving its goals and objectives. Now, in this particular slide, I've shown these 6 dimensions, which basically, focus on the power distance index, individualism versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, uncertainty versus certainty, long-term versus short-term, and indulgence versus restraint. Now, this particular slide also clearly gives us an idea that when we talk about power distance index, or PDI, here we are essentially looking at the degree to which people are comfortable with influencing upwards, and they accept that there is inequality within the organization. That means some people will have more power or more ability to be able to make decisions regarding employment, resources, finances, and this would be acceptable to them. So if you are looking at the power distance index, here you would normally have high to low, and you would see people strive to get higher power or more power within the organization. So similarly, he used examples to explain these 6 dimensions, and that is what we will look at also, just to get this absolutely crystal in terms of our understanding, for the study of the organizational culture. So when we look at Gert Hofstede, he was his work is now very well known, and it is now recognized that, when I say recognized, it is recognized in the sense that he helped establish through his studies the a deeper understanding of how culture is formed within the organization. What are the factors which affect the formation of formation of a type of a culture within the organization? And these 6 dimensions that he brought out, are quite useful in helping us understand, the various, aspects of how how the power, for example, individuality, masculinity, uncertainty, short-term versus long-term, and indulgence versus restraint actually help in shaping up a particular type of cultures within the organization. Now, we have also looked at Charles Handy's framework in the last learning outcome, wherein we talked about 4 different types of cultures that we get to see, which can be created or seen within the organization. And that could be because there are people with power culture, there are people who have influential roles, and that could be in role culture, task culture in particular, because when we look at people who have responsibility and decision-making authority to be able to influence the outcome of tasks. So that is where we'll see task culture. And then last but not the least, person culture, wherein the organization focuses on management of individuals or management of the manpower through human resource structures. And here what we tend to see is that the organization looks at recruiting like-minded individuals which will pursue common goals. And there, the idea would be to focus on individuals, because individuals they see as a key to be able to achieve, as a resource, they see them as a key to be able to help achieve the objectives which are set, by the management within the organization. Now, there are some other models as well, which were introduced, and obviously they are also critical to us, because they help us build an understanding to study what is organizational culture and how it influences the outcomes within the organization. The one such model that we are going to look at in the subsequent slides is going to be the Edgar Sheen's 3 dimensions that he has proposed. We will also be briefly looking at Jerry Johnson's and Kevin Scholes, cultural web, which was proposed by them after a lot of, research and studies that they carried out in the 1990s. And here, what we look at is it takes into account that, it takes into account certain assumptions which basically help the management focus on some of the key factors which can influence the type of culture which the organization actually, portrays. And here, the focus from the organizational perspective is on strategic issues. And when we look at, these issues being blocked, or, these issues not being highlighted, you would generally see that the organization either has, let's say the organization does not have productivity or suffers from productivity issues, and efficiency within the organization in terms of achieving its outcomes, suffers. So we will look at basically the cultural web model as well, which has 6 interrelated elements, which Kevin Scholes and Jerry Johnson actually proposed. And these were named as stories, rituals and routines, symbols, structure, control systems, and power cultures. So these 3 framework models that we look at, first one that we are focused on is the Hofstede cultural dimension model. We need to understand the 6 dimensions which he proposed. And then we'll go on to Edgar Schein. And then last but not the least, we look at Jerry Johnson and Kevin Scholes, 6 related elements, or 6 cultural elements which are related to defining and helping us understand what kind of culture and how the influence of culture can affect the outcomes within the organization. So going into a bit more detail, with Hofstede model, first one that we look at is the, power distance index that we talk about. So here, as I mentioned earlier, people understand that, there are going to be certain people within the organization which will have the ability to make more decisions, or they have higher decision-making power. And this is something which people or other colleagues within the organization will accept. Now, in some cases, high decision-making power or ability to be able to influence decisions and outcomes would basically put you towards high PDI or power distance index. And in some cases, if you have lower decision-making power or essentially no decision-making power, then you are going to be towards the lower end of that index, which is the power distance index that we look at. Now, here an example that I would do is, when we look at organizations and we look at structures of different organizations in different countries, we tend to see that in some countries, organization structures tend to be flat. In some, they tend to be hierarchical, and in some, they tend to be, matrix structures, which is a combination of hierarchical and, vertical structure. Now, here, if I look at the application of power distance index, what we're going to see is that in an organization or an organization based in a country, the example that I've quoted is Indonesia here. Sorry, just looking at Indonesia here. So here, what we talk about is that they have a PDI index of, say, for example, 78. Now, what we are basically saying is that here there is emphasis on unequal power distribution. Most organizations would have hierarchical management structure and directive, leadership. On the other hand, if you look at a Western economy or a country which is like Switzerland or United Kingdom, wherein the economies are developed, what you're going to see is a lower power index, distance index score, because here there are rules and regulations which are very well set in the organization, and equality and diversity are key policies which are enacted enacted by law, and obviously have to be accounted for when we look at organizations. So you would generally see people, having a low power, distance index, and you would see that there is generally equality in distribution of power within the organization. So here you are going to see the usability of PDI as one of the dimensions. If I look at comparing two different countries, two different operations, and because of the type of the nature of the operations and the type of the people working within the organization, you would see a certain type of culture. So in countries which are developing, you would generally see hierarchical structures, but in countries which are developed, you're going to primarily see flat structures, or essentially a culture wherein power is equally distributed amongst various employees or various departments as far as decision making is concerned. The second dimension that we look at is individualism versus collectivism. Now, this refers to how people in the society have formed ties. So when we look at individualism, it shows that the social framework is loosely knit. That means people mind their own business, and in this case, what you will generally see is that the high individual versus collectivism score would be characterized by the amount of freedom and privacy which the people would enjoy in that particular geography. So when we look at individualism, it is more about individual efforts, individual achievements, and looking at how I am different from others in terms of certain characteristics like my working style, my previous experience, my success, and things like that. On the other hand, when we talk about collectivism, here the society is going to refer to a tightly knit social network. That means here the individuals obviously would look after each other, but they will be also looking at working in groups. And here the rewards or the incentives which the people would get would be rewards if they are able to achieve the group work, they are able to achieve the teamwork, they are able to achieve tasks because of teamwork or group work or groupings essentially. And there is where we would focus on that as against individualism. Here the focus is going to be on everybody meeting the target, everybody going over the finishing line, and then the group or the let's say the team then looking at getting incentives or rewards or bonuses. Now, if we look at this from a point of view of an example and go back to the same example of Indonesia versus so underdeveloped versus a developing country or developed country, you would see Indonesia as a country would have a lower score on individualism versus collectivism, because it is going to focus primarily here. People will primarily focus on ensuring that they are able to do well as against and it is going to be me doing it or I am able to do it. But when we look at say countries like America or any other developed economy, here the emphasis is going to be on we, which is collective efforts. And essentially the idea would be to say, if you achieve it, or as a company we achieve it, everyone within the company actually ends up achieving it. And that is where the concept of collectivism comes in. Now, the third dimension that he brought across, Gert Hofstede, was basically looking at uncertainty avoidance index. So here it is more about to what extent we have ambiguity in decision making, or to what extent there is uncertainty within the organization, and it is mainly concerned with how people handle the unknown or handle the uncertainty within a particular situation. So you would generally see that people would essentially look at let's say have a score which is say UAI or uncertainty index score, and this would be looking into the outcomes of let's say the different UAI score would have different outcomes on the different parts of the society. So here as a society, what we would look at is that although the structure within the society in terms of how individuals would look at a particular situation would be dependent on whether they see opportunity or whether they see uncertainty within that situation. Now, as an example, this would be because if people are open-minded, they can see all possibilities and they can also look at them collectively discussing and then changing the outcome to suit the outcome which would benefit all the population or all the people within the organization. Now, a case in point, an example that I would give you here is Greece, for example, as a country has a very high score of uncertainty avoidance index because it shows that here, people are not comfortable with ambiguity. So what they do is they prefer to have rules and regulation or laws which would be, guiding them to, guiding them essentially to taking into a task or completing a task. Now, on the other hand, if you look at a developed country like Singapore, you are generally going to see that they are more comfortable with ambiguity because they see an opportunity within that ambiguity, from a point of view of, uncertainty. So they would be more willing to try out different options to see if there is gains or new sort of discoveries it can be done in terms of ensuring that these outcomes would help improve productivity or efficiency. But in some countries, you would generally see they would be focused on, just making sure that we go with the norm. We don't want uncertainty, and then we want to be safe rather than sorry. And that is where the score of uncertainty would be, or the index score would be quite high. We look at another dimension, which is masculinity versus femininity. So here, when we talk about masculinity versus femininity, or MAS in short, we would look at how duties are allocated between men and women. Now, when we talk about, masculine society, which basically has very clear defined roles for women and men, in such cases, what you're going to see is there are going to be expected outcomes which can demonstrate both positive traits as well as, positive traits like being fast, strong, and successful. But in the case of, masculinity, when Hofstede looked at studying it, he basically said that masculinity is representative of assertiveness, achievement, and material rewards. Now, this is opposite to femininity that he proposed, wherein he said that when we look at that versus, in isolation, what we do get to see is that femininity has more inclination to modesty, cooperation, quality of life, and caring for the weak. So if we have feminine society that does not clearly define male and female roles, but if you look at masculine society, that would clearly define male and female roles. And here these roles can or would overlap. And in some cases, the emphasis is going to be placed on stronger cooperation between people, good relationship, and, high quality of life. So again, to understand this dimension, if we take an example of Japan, which has a masculinity versus femininity, high score of 95, which is the highest in the developed society. Here you're going to see that this society behaves more or less in a patriarchal or hierarchical manner. So men tend to occupy higher positions or positions of power. They tend to work long hours, and they have commitments with families wherein, they are expected to do more work in terms of providing for the family than women. And here, women, in some cases, on the negative side, would be denied the chance to compete or advance in their careers within the society because they are seen to be a partner as a passive partner. And what we generally see in this case is that their role would be limited to looking at raising the family or being with the family rather than pursuing a career or, making a career out of their, for the purposes of pursuing a career or maybe making a career in the long run. So here we would generally see that people would essentially be more, let's say, tuned to expecting things from males, or people working within the organizations will be expected to contribute more working hours and expected to deliver results as against, women, which are going to be more in support functions within those organizations. Now, very briefly, just quickly looking at the last two dimensions that he proposed, one was short-term versus long-term. Now, when we look at the short-term dimension, here he talks about time horizon, which is basically looking at that, there is a tendency with people to delay gratification. That means people in society with long-term orientation, they tend to be more pragmatic. They want to invest more. They're going to be more persevering, and they will be looking at achieving results. On the other hand, the short-term orientation typically refers to society, emphasizing consistency, truth, and principles. Now, again, to understand this short-term versus long-term as a whole, what I would suggest is that when we look at an example of Indonesia, wherein there is a high score of 62, it shows that the society is quite pragmatic. People tend to value savings. They look at investing. They look at persevering, and they, kind of shun thriftiness, which is to spend money or waste money on objects which might not be relevant for them from a point of view of achieving their objectives. On the other hand, if you look at US in general, they would be showing short-term orientation, because here people are quick to arrive at results. They have a bit of a short-term focus in terms of achieving goals and objectives. Their convictions are quite strong, and obviously they emphasize rights and values. So issues in terms of profit and loss are reported quarterly, whereas you would see in countries like Indonesia, there would be reported monthly. And this is because of the fact that they are more focused on, the long-term, gains which the organization can make, or the country can make, or the subsidiary of the organization can make within the country. And that is where short-term versus long-term orientation, comes in. The last dimension that, Hofstede proposed was that this was added something quite later, and what he proposed was that when we look at talking about satisfying desires and looking at how people control their desires and impulses, we then talk about restraint and indulgence. So indulgence would show that society tends to have more fun and enjoy life in terms of free gratification. On the other side, in contrast, when you look at restraints, would indicate that society suppresses gratification mainly through, applying social pressure. So here, Russia, for example, would have a high score in terms of restraint culture, and the issues which are related, to this would be that they would spend more time in leisure than, essentially looking at more time in work. And that is where restraint versus indulgence as a, as a key feature comes in when we look at, Hofstede 6 dimensions to study and understand culture within the organization. So I hope this is clear. If there are any questions, feel free to ask me through the chat route, or you can ask me now, and then we'll move on to some of the other aspects of covering learning outcome 4. Now, one of the aspects that we want to also understand briefly is looking at what is the influence of globalization and digital technologies on the organizational culture in 21st century. Now, does the advancement in technologies and globalization, which means companies having operations in different companies or different countries, does it provide them opportunities? Does it give them challenges that they need to face in order to gain efficiencies or realize the benefits of working in those geographies in terms of increasing business or market share? Now, what we do get to see is this is where we can apply, Gert's Hofstede models, simply because when we look at globalization and the impact of digital technologies, we can apply the 6 dimensions model to understand whether this would be aiding the company. When I say this, I mean by that is whether globalization will aid the operations of a company in terms of increasing its market share, increasing profitability, or in some cases, will it pose more challenges when we look at evaluating them through the aspect of using the Gert Hofstede model. Now, technologies obviously, and the advancement in technologies that have happened over the years would be quite useful for the organization to have, because in some cases, what they would use is what they would do is basically use the new technology which is available, and that would help reduce dependence on, say, traditional methods which would be applied in order to get work done. So when we look at this, we can apply the 6 dimensions of the Hofstede model, and that gives us very clear indication that the influence of technologies in particular is positive on the organization and organizational culture, because technology aids in better communication, technologies aid in better decision making, and technologies also increase the efficiency within the organization, in particular when we talk about the allocation and resource allocation in particular, and also the decision making process, because it comes to our aid in terms of knowledge management systems, which then allow managers and leaders to be able to use existing data and make much more favorable decisions, which would suit better in terms of achieving the outcomes for the organization. Now, one of the other things that we also want to look at very briefly is power, and the use of power, and the control of power in particular with regards to people when they have it, and what kind of influence they are able to do or create on the organizational culture. Now, there are hard and soft sources of power. Now, the reason why we say this hard sources and soft sources of power is, hard sources of power could be tangible resources. That means this could be used to reward people. And this type of power normally includes physical force, financial resources, or legal authority. And that would be associated with formal positions of power. When we talk about soft sources of power, we basically look at, talking about soft sources, which are in terms of intangible resources, which could be used for rewarding, individuals within the organization. And this type of power includes, soft power sources of power would include, expertise, knowledge, and personal relationships. That means it is more individually driven, basis your experience. If you work for an organization in 20 years, you have a lot of experience, you have faced some of the situations before, and that would be seen as soft sources of power, because you could use that. It is individual to you. You could use that, use the learnings from it to put it to a particular situation and have a favorable outcome for the organization. And that would be, because you have been in that situation before, and that will be classified as soft sources of power. Now, when we look at soft and hard sources of power, what we also look at is 3 aspects through which we can, look at this from an organizational standpoint of view. One is individual viewpoint, the other is relational viewpoint, and the third is structural viewpoint. Now, when we talk about individual viewpoint, we are looking at individual as a whole, what characteristics, what background you have, and what are the things that are going to influence you and your decision-making criteria. And that would be termed and seen within the individual viewpoint. When we talk about relational viewpoint, we see here dynamics between you and the team, or dynamics between you and your boss, or you or within the organization. And here, what ability or control you have to be able to exercise influence over others in a relationship to be able to, influence the decision or the outcome of that decision. So that is where here your relational viewpoint will be taken into account, wherein it takes into account your existing experience, but also looks into account your social status, your reputation, and your ability to be able to use resources to get things done. Structural viewpoint tends to be where we see complex structures within the organization. That means you would see a hierarchical structure, but that would be merged with a matrix or a let's say hierarchical structure, but also merged with matrix structure. So here what will happen is you might have certain influence over individuals in different departments, and this is going to be useful for you because you would be able to then, let's say, work across different teams or different groups and get your work done with the use of, relationships that you can put or use in place that you already have because you worked in the organization for long, and because you also understand the structure of the organization quite well, so you know which buttons to be pressed, or who are the right people to be spoken to be able to actually get things done. So this point of view essentially would be looking at power which comes from controlling economic resources within the organization, and also being able to influence others within the organization because of having positive relationships with those individuals. Now, one of the other points that we will look at is basis when we know what are the type of powers which are available within the organization and what is used, what is the output and what is the controlling use of those powers and how it influences culture. What we also want to do is understand how this power can be used in different circumstances and situations within the organization to be able to achieve goals. Now, simple example that I would give you here is that assuming, as a person working within the marketing department, you are handling events. And if you're handling events, you are tasked with an important responsibility of taking the company to, say, one of the exhibitions which happens in the US, like CTIA. Now, this is an annual exhibition. There are maybe 200 other companies which participate, and it tends to be one of the biggest events which happens in the calendar. And what you're expected to do is look into, organizing operationally the event for the for a particular organization. Now, here, what I'm going to be looking at is we are going to be able to use lots of things in terms of one, relationship, second in terms of communication, third in terms of resources, fourth in terms of because of the title and the responsibility I have in the organization, the decision-making ability I have, and last but not the least, some of the connections that I have with other employees within different departments. I'll be using them to basically ensure that this event becomes very successful. Now, you could essentially be doing all this on your own, but your manager or your boss might not be quite happy with it because you wield a lot of power. You have a lot of personal relationships in place, and these relationships allow you to become quite popular, and anything that you propose goes forward. Employees like it, or your colleagues like it, but your manager does not like that you have so much power or influence, essentially, because of the relationships that you've garnered and the experience that you've carried out or gained in the last few years while working for the organization. So in this case, you would generally see your boss's behavior to be different towards you, and his evaluation of your performance is going to be more critical in your context, because he or she would feel that although you've been able to get the work done, but you have used unnecessary force to be able to get people to work for you, or to get people to recognize and obviously sanction this particular bit. And that is where you would see the power struggle happening between you and your manager, or you and your boss within the organization. And when we talk about these power struggle, this power struggle in particular, they would be defined as bases of power. And these bases of power would be, classified under different situations by different names. So one such thing that I would say is formal authority. One of the bases of power that you have could be because you have formal authority. That means you are in a position, or you occupy a job title within the organization, such as a manager, supervisor, general manager, vice president. This is because you have formal authority. Now, you could also have expert authority. That means you have derived this knowledge from previous experiences of your working within different organizations or different places. And because you become a functional expert in that area, you wield a power called expert power. Now, there is something that you could also have, which is called coercion or coercive power. And when we say coercive power, this is a power that you have that helps, is a type of power that you employ because of the use of force and threats, and you basically look at threatening in some cases. If you are, and in some situations, what you do is you use that carrot and stick approach, which is to say, if you are not able to do this for me, then these are the consequences which will happen. So if you are not able to achieve the target, then the consequences are that you're going to lose your job. So you're using threat as an option to kind of exercise power. Then you have reward and you have referent. So when we talk about reward, we talk about power that is derived with the ability wherein you are able to provide positive outcomes or rewards such as promotions and bonuses. So you're in a position, you like the employee who does work very hard, and the employee is able to achieve the objectives, thereby helping your department or you to achieve the objectives. So here, what you do is you promote the employee, or you give them a promotion in terms of wages, salary, whatever it is, and that would be reward power. Referent power would be power which is derived from personal characteristics or trait. That means people admire you, they respect you because of the charisma that you have, or the trust that you have, or the reputation which has been set because the way you come across and the way you deal with people by giving respect. And they have then developed over the years trust with you, and that is referent power which comes in when we talk, you being able to influence and control the behavior of other individuals or employees within the organization. Now, we also look at power controls, because in any organization, you would have a title, you'll have your roles and responsibility, and you'll also have certain characteristics which go along with it. Now, no organization or no department or no manager would allow somebody to have absolute power. So here, when we look at controlling, the ability that you have to be able to make decisions can be done by introducing what is called power controls. And when we talk about power controls, what we are looking at doing is talking about checks and balances, the code of conduct, and accountability mechanisms. That means you're free to make decisions, but your decisions should have positive outcomes. Or in some cases, sometimes you see that you as a marketing manager, have spent a lot of money on the events and promotions, but it has not been able to get me the achievement, or the organization has not been able to achieve the objectives which were set out in return for spending this, say, money on advertising and promotion. Now, in those cases, it is accountability issues or mechanisms which are used, and that would mean that maybe in the subsequent years there would be more reviews which will happen, and the management would not sanction the budgets, or would essentially put prohibitions or riders to be able to utilize that budget, provided you meet this objective, then you can utilize this. You meet that objective or achieve this target, then you are able to utilize this budget. And these would be used as measures to control and restrict the decision-making ability that you have, which is essentially nothing but power, which you have because of the title or the role that you occupy within the organization. Now, when we talk about power, how do we look at defining power? Power could be, you have the ability to be able to allocate resources, financial resources, which is money, or sanction, budgets. You could have a power to be able to control the flow of information, investment in terms of technology or systems within the organization. And in some cases, opportunities or resources which can be restricted because of, social networks within the organization. Now, when we talk about these in general, these are going to be used as checks and balances, or essentially measures to be able to restrict the amount of power or the sources of power which an individual would enjoy within the organization. Because if you have absolute power, you can do anything in the organization. You can rub the individual wrong way. You can, motivate them to do and achieve the objectives. You might take them into a different direction without having to realize that, this is not something which the organization desires. And as a result, you would essentially take the organization away from the goals. So what the leadership does in this case is to introduce checks and balances to ensure that there is no absolute usage of power to be able to fulfill personal objectives. you generally see that the organization, the management, and the leadership team within the organization would then look at limiting the amount of resources that you get access to, and that would be related to restricting you essentially on the decision-making ability, i.e. power. Now, any questions, feel free to ask me. Now, one of the other aspects that we will look at is when we talk about how organizations work and what kind of decision-making ability which people have, you would see that this is generally coming out of structures. So you see top management, middle management, junior management, or lower management. Now they have, depending on the role and responsibilities that they execute, they would also then be looking at having the ability to be able to sanction or buy resources or invest in certain type of resources to be able to carry out those day-to-day functions. So when we look at the use of power, the authority, essentially, if I use the word authority, at some stage you would see that this would then also be influenced by politics, which is happening within the organization. And we talked about one of the initial bits, which is looking at culture of the organization. So culture, politics, and power, as you would see, would essentially be the tools which senior management team would essentially use to control one or the other. Now, when we talk about various types of structures within the organization, you would generally see that structural divisions would mean that each organization or each department within the company is looking at meeting those objectives. Like in the case of sales, they are looking at meeting sales objectives, generating revenue or increasing the turnover of the organization. Or if I look at operations department, they would be focused on ensuring efficiency and cost savings. If I look at any other department like marketing, they would be looking at minimizing the spend or maximizing the spend to be able to aid the sales team in achieving those objectives, and thereby working in tandem with some of the other departments to help achieve the organization move forward. Now, here is where we would look at different arguments. One such argument is going to be structural divisions. Second argument is going to be different priorities and interest. And the other one is going to be differences in interpretation or implementation of policies and rules. Now, what we see, in summary, if I have to talk about organizational politics, what we see is that organizational politics can actually arise because of various factors or a variety of factors. Now, these could include divisions within the organization. It could include differing priorities with different departments and interests within the organization. This could also be in terms of how you interpret the goals and objectives which are set by the management, and how do you go about implementing these goals and objectives which are set by the management for a particular financial year within the organization. And if we understand these factors, then it can help not just the individuals, but also the organizations to be able to manage and mitigate any sort of negative effects that these could have on the organizational policies. Now, when we talk about these as negative effects on organizational policies, we're also looking at creation of, collaborative and, some sort of a congenial environment where it is going to be useful for the individuals to work. They're going to be more productive. They're going to work together in a team, and they would be looking at achieving the objectives which have been set, by the organization. So politics side of things can be influenced, organizational politics within the organization can be influenced by a variety of factors. And these could be how people work in different divisions, in short, what priorities different divisions or departments have. And last but not the least, what are the key interests which employees and managers within those departments have to be able to then help guide the individuals, or in this case employees, to achieve the objectives which the organization is trying to achieve, or the goals which the organization is trying to achieve. Now, when we talk about political activity, what we also look at is that when we talk about political activity and when changes are introduced within the organization, you would generally see political activity coming into swing. So if we are trying to change, for example, the way organization works, example, case in point, let's look at here is that Microsoft and some of the other companies globally are looking at now, working or changing the working week to 4 days a week. So here, what they're trying to do is save a bit of money in terms of wages, which are paid to full-time employees, but at the same time, they're trying to, restrict the number of days the employees would need to work, and they are introducing they have introduced in certain countries like a 4-day week. And this means that what they are trying to experiment at this stage is to see if employees can actually complete the work which is given to them in 4 days, and then that would mean that one of the days during the week they can take as off, and that would also mean a bit of savings to Microsoft in terms of the payroll and other bits for the organization. Now, when we talk about change and the resistance to change within the organization, you would generally see organizational politics starts to come up. If people do not like what is being talked about or what is being introduced, you will generally see people start grouping together and they start gossiping. And this gossip generally tends to then start creating circles which are going to be against, the aspect of introducing this change within the organization. And this would mean that at some stage, if the leaders or managers fail to, sense this particular discomfort because of the change being introduced, you would see that there would be, a lot of politics happening within the organization. And in general, what that would influence is they will start to build, when I say they, I mean employees would start to informally chat, and they would start to build a resistance to this change, which is going to be implemented in the organization at some point in time. And this resistance to change is politically influenced because employees are not liking the change. And what they're doing is discussing amongst themselves and leading to putting pressure on, key decision makers. And that is what we call lobbying. They will lobby the key decision makers to do away with this change or not introduce this change at all. So political behavior would be associated with, I would say, conflict and resistance when people or management looks at introducing change within the organization. And this becomes an important part. And in summary, what I would say is that sometimes when we look at individual behavior, this can be manifested in terms of, not being happy with change being introduced, and that can lead to conflict and resistance. And that would mean that that would mean that organization would go through certain periods without being able to implement this change, even if it is happening for good. And if as a manager or as a leader, I understand this dynamic of, power and what is the motivation behind this particular political lobbying or movement or gossip or, whatever you call it, then I would be able to sensitize relevant individuals within the organization, which is management. And then I would look at mitigating some of these negative effects or behavior which the individuals are showing and create a more collaborative and productive environment, which will then help me, implement that change within the organization. So any questions on this so far? So what we are trying to do is understand how power politics can influence culture within the organization. So when we look at change, if change is not being liked by employees, you would generally see political side of activity increasing, and this would lead to people talking about it and then trying to lobby and gather support from like-minded individuals who do not want this change, and that leads to creation of politics within the organization. Now, when we talk about culture of the organization, what we also want to see is that the culture, as I mentioned earlier, is a combination of shared values, beliefs, assumptions, and practices which the organization then puts into some sort of a employee code or an employee manual. And that is what most employees follow through when they do or carry out their day-to-day responsibility. Now, this particular bit that we get to see in terms of employee handbook also then has policies and procedures, rewards and incentives, or positives which the employees can get if they show certain characteristics which are expected of them while they execute their roles or work on their day-to-day roles within the organization. Now, when we look at the employee handbook, it also has things like appraisals. It also looks at performance management. And then when we look at performance management and appraisals, we also talk about what are the incentives and schemes or rewards which the organization has put or is looking at putting in place for individuals who show the right behavior or the expected behavior, in terms of executing their day-to-day responsibilities. Now, some part of this culture can also be highly regulated in certain sectors. For example, healthcare, in financial services, you would generally see that the culture tends to be more driven because of the structure of the organization, and the structure of the organization here tends to be more hierarchical. And that is where the reason why it is more hierarchical is because of the regulatory requirements of that particular sector. So when we look at financial services, a lot of regulation comes in, and what you generally see is that the regulation would influence some of the requirements which the organization would need to maintain and adhere to, and that would essentially be creating a bit of regulated framework of little or giving little maneuverability to employees to be able to work within their roles, and they have to conform to most of it, working from what has been given out as guidance. Now, in those cases, you would generally see company goals, employee behavior being, regulated. And in those cases, you would generally see that the organization tend to be quite productive, because there is a use and pure implementation of policy and procedures and guidelines which have been set. And this is primarily, as I mentioned before, because of the regulation in that sector, because of legislation in that sector, and last but not the least, little maneuverability which the employees have due to the services that they offer, or the organization's services that they offer to clients or customers in the market. Now, we would also look at understanding, what would be, when I say culture, we talked about, things which are related to values, beliefs, assumptions, and practices. So if I look at each of these individual factors in terms of values, these values are going to be, let's say, important for the organization, because they would help understand what is applied, or how the decision-making process is applied when we look at the key attributes of values and beliefs within the organization. This would also then be seen in expectation in terms of behavior. And we will also see this in terms of, sometimes when you see that what happens is that people in the organization would lead by example. So sometimes what happens is, if you're given a target, and you're given a target which you feel is quite, is quite stretched, or is something not achievable, what you will generally see is the manager would, let me say, give you an example. The manager would essentially step in and say, okay, let me show you how this can be done. And once he does it, he also emphasizes on the fact that, yes, this is the approach that you need to be able to take to be able to get things done. And that is an example wherein the leader or the manager sets a role model, becomes a role model, and explains how this particular job or responsibility can be executed to achieving the target or the objective being set. Now, let's look at another important example, which is talking about Sheen's model, which is important, from a point of view of understanding the culture. Now, Sheen came across with three different, dimensions. One was artifact, the other was espouse values, and third was basic assumptions. Now, his model in general, when we see, talks about, let's say, I'll put it this way, that his particular model gives us understanding of culture and how it impacts the working within the organization. So he developed this framework, which is the three levels of culture that we see: artifacts, espoused values, and assumptions and beliefs. And he also emphasized the importance of leadership in creating and sustaining this strong culture, which is based on clear communication, the ability of the organization to manage learning, and last but not the least, the ability of the organization to adapt in certain situations when they are faced with, say, or when they are faced with certain situations. Let's put it this way. So when I look at artifacts, it talks about visible organizational structure and business processes. When I talk about espoused values, it talks about strategies, goals, and visions. And when we talk about assumptions and belief, it talks about unconscious beliefs and perceptions, thoughts and feelings, which are unwritten, something like an unwritten rule within the organization. And the organization would carry out that particular function or do it in a certain way, even though it has not been written out in policies and procedures, because of the fact that these are unwritten rules and they have been tried out in the past and the organization has achieved success on the back of it. So here, sometimes you would see decisions which are made can lead to conflicts, but they can be resolved easily because there are past instances available of why this has worked or why this has not worked. Now, by understanding these different levels of how culture can be seen within an organization and the values which determine the different levels, what Sheen basically guided us was that when we talk about decision making and we talk about developing strategies, for managing and changing the culture within the organization, it is important for us to take into account the contribution which the culture of the organization, which is basically values, beliefs, and we talk about, assumptions which the management would have, and they would be put into practice in order to ensure that the expected outcomes are achieved by the team or by the people working within the organization. Now, when we talk about different types of organizational cultures, we see that culture can be influenced by vision and values, can be influenced by leadership, the way leaders and managers communicate to employees within the organization, how is training and development handled within the organization, what kind of rewards and recognition are provided. And these factors can clearly help understand that why this organization is highly productive, highly efficient, and has a great culture, or people want to work within this organization, and why this particular organization in this retrospect does not have the culture and people are demotivated and generally see high turnover, and why this organization does not attract the best talent in the market. So factors which influence organizational culture tend to be how vision and how the values of the organization are. So when I talk about corporate social responsibility, you would see certain organizations, like Apple or Google or Microsoft, they would, have key agendas on CSR, and they would generally be also contributing to providing budgets towards the corporate social responsibility. And that would mean that they are also returning something back to the society. So, for example, when we look at buying surf, or when you look at buying, say, some material which is produced as a brand by Procter & Gamble or Unilever, you would see that some part of the promotions that they do is they promote that, okay, if you buy, the nappies, the baby nappies that you normally generally buy from the high street of the stores, P&G or essentially Unilever donates a certain amount of that costs from there towards providing, better water facilities in Africa. Now, this is where it is seen that there are clear values within the organization to give something back to the society. The plan is signed off by the management, and that would mean that generally people would see this as a positive aspect, and would be more open to accepting products from that organization. Now, towards the end, what we also want to look at is, I want to put into the foray, two theoretical models. Network theory, which has a particular view in terms of how organizations are organized as a collection of nodes, and they are connected by various types of relationships. These relationships can be formal, informal, and they would allow the individuals to form alliances and friendships while being able to deliver and continue to work within the organization. Now, the network structure is focused on interdependence, and it focuses on the importance of relationship within the organization. So the strength and the quality of relationship between individuals here would influence the communication, collaboration, and the decision-making ability of the organization. So here, if I say the organization focuses on network structure, what we are looking at saying is that this focus is on size, density, and the type of relationship which the employees would have, with other peers within the organization. So here, you would generally see that this kind of an organization is going to be quite efficient at transmitting information and making decisions. Now, this is a theoretical model, and you have to understand what the theory actually proposes. Then we look at systems theory. Systems theory emphasizes that interdependence is there, and it is there between different parts of the organization, like different departments. Sales depends on marketing, marketing depends on finance, finance depends on, some of the other departments. And this interdependence allows the organization as a whole to function as a single unit. And here, if I look at an holistic view, an organization is a separate entity, is an entity within itself. So it has to have interdependence amongst various departments to be able to work as a single entity. And this is where it focuses on systems theory, which is to say that, if there is a change required in one part of the system, then unintended consequences can happen or changes can happen on the other side of the system, because before we implement a change in one department or part of the organization, we need to look at how that change would affect the others or other parts of the organization. And here the dependency is primarily on feedback loops, which basically mean that the organization, if it should introduce any sort of a change, they would look at taking feedback, both positive and negative, from people and employees within the organization, and would then study to the aspect to say whether this feedback is positive or negative, whether it creates stability or instability within the organization, whether it help the organization move forward, or will it take the organization backwards. And this aspect allows, managers and leaders to be able to decide whether the organization, works through network the theory, or it kind of works through system theory. Network theory because interdependence amongst individuals, but system theory interdependence amongst departments. So this is at the department level, and network is at individual level. And that is what the balancing act tends to be when managers and leaders look at studying the culture within the organization. So in summary, if we look at network and systems theory, they tend to provide two frameworks which help us understand organizations better, and the development of culture and the type of culture within the organization. The network theory and the systems theory also look at essentially helping us in realizing that there are relationships which get formed within individuals, between individuals when they work within a department, and also between different departments of the organization. And that is where it is important for the management to be able to establish mechanisms to take feedback. And this feedback is which is the mechanism that they put in place, tends to be termed as feedback loops. And these feedback loops help us in understanding or developing a better understanding of how organizations operate. What is the influence of power? What is the influence of culture? What is the influence of politics within the organization? And these are things which are taken up in management meetings to ensure that there is no politics, or to ensure that there is a balance of power amongst employees when the targets and objectives are set for people to be able to help the organization achieve that at the end of the year. And that is where we look at examining power, politics, and the influence of power and politics on the creation of culture within the organization. And that culture essentially is nothing but influence of employees in terms of how they behave, what experience, characteristics, and attitude they bring to their place of work, and how does the organization use their skills, their characteristics, their attributes, using motivational theories to be able to help achieve organizational goals. So I hope this session has been useful and it has given you clear understanding in terms of, what is the influence and importance of power and politics to the culture of the organization, and how it can help influence employee behavior and help the organization achieve its objectives at the end of the month, at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, or at the end of a business cycle. Now, there are some additional readings which I've created for you, which are uploaded onto Moodle. And what I would do is essentially show them to you briefly so that you are aware of this and you are able to take this forward with regards to, developing a bit more understanding in terms of what we've discussed today, with regards to the three more important theories. So let me just quickly share one or two handouts, which I think are going to be useful for you to do some study. And they would be one particular handout in level 4, learning outcome 4. And this particular handout, as you can see, talks about understanding organizational culture. It will give you some details about the three main theories that we have looked at for understanding organizational culture, which is Edgar Sheen's model, Gert Hofstede model, Charles Handy's model that we've discussed in Learning Outcome 1, and then Jerry Johnson's and Kevin Scholl's framework of the cultural web, which also, provides 6 elements in terms of understanding organizational behavior. This is one handout. The second handout that I would recommend that you need to look at and study would be to go into looking at one of the chapters of the book, which are defined, and that is uploaded on Moodle. So let me share that with you now. And I would suggest that this particular chapter that you look at is going to be useful for you to understand, the reason of why we look at the 3 dimensions of Charles, Sheen's model, Edgar Sheen's model, and Charles Handy's 4 dimensions of power and culture in the organization. So these are the handouts which I would refer that you need to go through, which will help you crystallize and understand the culture and how the organizational culture, basically developing an understanding of the organizational culture, which is influenced by power and politics within the organization. So we will be looking at discussing assignment brief for the session tomorrow. So I will upload the assignment briefs so that you can actually go through them beforehand. And then what we are going to do is look at, a detailed discussion in terms of how the evidence can be created for this particular assignment. And that is where we will try and complete the delivery of this unit. So thanks so much for being on the session today, and I will catch up with you same time tomorrow. Until then, take care and bye for now.